Kevin Costner, an enduring monument of American cinema, the guardian of hearts in The Bodyguard, the dreamer who built a diamond field out of faith in Field of Dreams, and the visionary who rewrote Hollywood's narrative with Dances with Wolves, stands today as one of the last torches of old-world storytelling. He is not just a performer but a craftsman of emotion, a man who turned stillness into speech and solitude into something sacred. Behind every frame he's ever stood in, there is a heartbeat that belongs not just to an actor but to a poet, forged by struggle, silence, and storms. His life didn't begin with luxury. It began in the hum of power lines and the smell of engine grease, in a small rented house in Linwood, California, where dreams were measured in paychecks and prayers. Kevin Michael Costner was born on January 18, 1955, the youngest son of William Bill Costner, a ditch digger who became a power line technician, and Sharon Ray, a social worker whose heart was bigger than her rest. His father's boots came home every night coated in the color of the earth, his palms cracked and calloused from building what the world broke. His mother's eyes carried the fatigue of helping strangers survive their own heartbreaks, yet she still managed to hum as she cooked, filling that little house with melodies softer than hope itself. Their life was simple, built not on excess but endurance. The warmth inside their walls didn't come from money, it came from love. Quiet, unspoken, the kind that doesn't need to be declared because it's seen in every act of staying. But there was another presence in that home, something unseen, tender, and tragic. 2 years before Kevin's birth, in 1953, his brother Mark Douglas lived only one fragile day before his heart fell silent. It was a loss that reshaped the family, the kind of pain that seeps into the foundation of a house and never leaves. Bill and Sharon never talked about it much, but grief has a way of changing the way people love. His father became a man of rules and protection, a man who built fences around his sons as if to keep the world from stealing another. His mother learned to love in quieter ways, her affection folded into long glances, the brush of a hand on a shoulder, a smile that trembled before it bloomed. Sometimes, Kevin would walk into the kitchen and find her staring at an empty corner, her face calm but distant, her eyes somewhere else entirely. She never said what she was thinking, but even as a child, he knew it was about the one who never came home. Bill would look up at her, then back down at the table, his silence thick enough to hold the whole room still. In that hush, Kevin learned one of life's deepest truths, that pain can live in a family like an invisible guest, never raising its voice, yet always sitting beside you. Maybe that's why, even as a boy, Kevin carried himself with a kind of listening soul. He wasn't loud, he didn't seek attention, he absorbed it. He watched people, how they spoke, how they moved, how they hid what they felt. He learned that the truest things in life are never shouted, they're whispered, often through action rather than words. By the time he turned 12, he had already known what it meant to lose and rebuild, to start again from nothing. The Costners were always on the move. Compton, Ventura, Visalia, Orange County, packing up their lives every few years, chasing stability that always seemed a few paychecks away. We were always packing, always starting over, Kevin would later say. I learned to keep my world inside. The tearing sound of tape across cardboard became his first soundtrack. New schools brought new faces, new promises, and new goodbyes. Every move taught him how to adapt, how to stand alone, how to carry himself with quiet resolve when everything familiar disappeared behind him. He wasn't the star athlete, nor the loud kid who commanded rooms. He was the one teachers sometimes forgot to call on, the quiet boy scribbling thoughts in the margins of his notebooks, poems, small reflections, half-dreams. While others played to be seen, Kevin watched, feeling everything more deeply than he could explain. On long car rides, he'd stare out the window, watching the streetlights blur into ribbons of gold, his reflection hovering between who he was and who he might become. That boy, silent, soft-spoken, and searching, would one day build a bridge between loneliness and legend. He learned to make peace with silence because it had been his oldest friend. In the noise of Hollywood, that silence became his anchor. And yet, that quiet little boy would grow into a man whose voice could move nations. He would take the grief of a lost brother, the tenderness of a mother's restraint, and the hard lessons of a father's labor and turn them into art that spoke to millions. From the dirt of Linwood to the stars of Los Angeles, from the hum of power lines to the roar of applause, Kevin Costner's journey was never about chasing fame. It was about chasing meaning. Every character he's played carries a whisper from that boy watching his mother stare at an empty space. Every line he's delivered has the weight of a family's unspoken prayers. And even when his personal life fractured, 2 broken marriages, 7 children from 3 women, love stories scarred by betrayal and exhaustion, he never let bitterness define him. He turned heartbreak into depth, failure into fuel, loss into legacy. The applause could never drown the silence that shaped him. The spotlight could never warm the chill of those nights when success came home to an empty house. But even at 70, after decades of triumph and turmoil, Kevin Costner still stands, steadfast, scarred, but unbroken. The boy who once watched the world roll by through a backseat window became the man who built worlds on screen, giving voice to the quiet, dignity to the forgotten, and meaning to the ordinary. So if his strength has ever steadied you, if his films ever made you believe in second chances, in forgiveness, or in the possibility that good men still exist, then take a moment to honor him, not as a star but as a survivor. Because Kevin Costner's story isn't about fame, it's about endurance. It's about a man who carried silence like a shield, pain like a teacher, and love like a promise that refuses to die. And that, more than anything, is what makes him not just a legend of film, but a living testament to the quiet, unstoppable power of the human spirit. He whispered goodbye to another town that never learned his name, another street that forgot his footsteps as soon as they faded, and another sky that would never remember the boy who once dreamed beneath it. It was cruel in the way only childhood can be, teaching him how to let go before he ever learned how to belong, showing him that home was not a place but a decision to keep walking when the world refused to wait. Yet beneath that quiet ache, something fierce began to grow, a belief that even if no one saw him now, he could one day build something that would outlast the silence. By his final years of high school, Kevin Costner had grown, not just taller, though he stood now at 6'1", but deeper, steadier, shaped by the ache of always starting over. The boy who once hid in the corners of classrooms now began to reach for light in unexpected places. In church choirs, his voice trembled with yearning as though trying to sing his way toward meaning. At night, he scribbled verses in worn notebooks, poems about skies that never stayed still, about second chances, and people who left before they said goodbye. He dreamed of open fields, of land that didn't move beneath his feet, of stories that didn't have to fit in cardboard boxes. His father's relentless discipline became his compass. His mother's faith became the ground he stood on. He would later say, almost as if confessing to himself, "I guess I was used to starting over." But that line wasn't about moving houses, it was about moving through life, through losses, through the long quiet in-between. Every goodbye carved endurance into him. Every silence taught him how to listen for the truth underneath noise. He understood early that life never guarantees comfort. It only offers chances, fleeting, fragile, to begin again. And from those chances, Kevin Costner built the courage to tell stories that would one day move the world. He was not born to greatness. He was shaped in the hidden, uncelebrated spaces where greatness is forced to earn its breath. But what does a dream cost when you are 23, newly married, broke, and trembling beneath the weight of expectation? For Kevin Costner, it cost everything: safety, security, pride, and the comfort of knowing you hadn't failed the people who believed in you. In 1978, with a degree in marketing and finance from California State University, Fullerton, he did the respectable thing. He found a stable job. He dressed in pressed shirts and routine smiles, performing the quiet tragedy of a man dying a little each day in exchange for a paycheck. The life was steady, but the silence inside him grew unbearable. Numbers didn't move him. Stories did. He could feel them beneath his skin, whispering that the safe path was just another kind of slow death. And then, as if the universe finally decided he had earned his test, fate appeared, on an airplane wearing the face of Richard Burton. It was supposed to be an ordinary flight home from his honeymoon in Mexico. But when Kevin looked to his right and saw one of the greatest actors of the century sitting beside him, the world seemed to stop breathing. Nervously, he leaned over and confessed the truth he had buried for years. He wanted to act, but fear held him back. Burton studied him quietly, those weathered eyes heavy with stories, and said simply, "You have green eyes, I have green eyes, I think you'll be fine." The words sank deep, like seeds dropped into dry soil. When the plane landed, Burton's limousine waited at the runway while Kevin and his wife stood by for a bus. The older man leaned out the window one last time, the noise of the airport fading like a heartbeat, and whispered two words that would echo through Kevin's entire life: "Good luck." It was brief, it was ordinary, and yet it was holy. That tiny moment cracked open a door in his soul that would never close again. Within weeks, Kevin quit his job. The applause never came. The world didn't cheer. It turned its back. He packed one suitcase, grabbed a secondhand jacket, and drove a weather-beaten Datsun toward Los Angeles with barely enough cash for gas. What followed was not the romantic struggle dreamers like to imagine. It was hunger, humiliation, and bone-deep fatigue. He scrubbed boats until his fingers split. He drove delivery trucks, gave star home bus tours, and wondered if he would ever have a home of his own. When his apartment's heater broke, he slept in his clothes, whispering to himself in the dark, "Just one more day, keep going, just one more day." The smell of salt and diesel became his perfume. The cracks in his hands became his calling card. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was chasing survival, clinging to the thinnest thread of belief that something sacred waited ahead. Pride kept him from calling home. He couldn't bear to let his parents hear the fatigue in his voice. Days blurred into nights, nights into silence. He carried his dreams in a crumpled folder of headshots, their edges damp with sweat, knocking on doors that stayed closed. "Leave your photo," casting agents would say, without looking up, their voices flat, their eyes already on someone else. Some days, he walked miles just to save the bus fare, his shoes thinning, his stomach twisting in knots of hunger. On cold nights, he parked outside studio gates, watching extras spill out under floodlights, their laughter cutting through the fog while he sat in darkness, unseen. Los Angeles, the city of golden promises, had given him only indifference, but even in that indifference, something inside him hardened into resolve. He refused to go home defeated. Then, one afternoon, as if the universe decided to test the last spark left in him, a classmate from acting lessons mentioned a tiny beach movie shooting nearby. No pay, no fame, just background roles to fill empty frames. Kevin showed up barefoot, his hair sun-bleached, his skin roughened by work and weather. "We just need someone who will do the work," the director said. Kevin nodded. That he knew how to do better than anyone. And when the camera finally turned his way, for one heartbeat, something inside him shifted. It wasn't joy, not even hope. It was defiance. The kind of quiet defiance born in boys who've been forgotten by too many towns, who've said too many goodbyes, and who decide that if the world refuses to see them, they'll build their own world instead. In that single moment, beneath the hum of film reels and the salt-stained air of the California coast, Kevin Costner's life stopped being about survival and began its long, unstoppable climb toward destiny. It was just him, the lens, and a vow whispered so quietly that only his own heartbeat could hear it. A promise that no matter how many doors closed, he would never stop showing up. His first film, Sizzle Beach, USA, was supposed to be his entry into the world he had dreamed of for years, but it almost destroyed him instead. Cheaply made, awkwardly cut, and released years later against his will, it felt like a cruel joke that the first proof of his dream looked more like a punchline than a beginning. "I wished I could buy every copy and burn it," he later admitted. And he meant it. The humiliation burned, but the deeper pain came from being unseen, from feeling like a ghost wandering the outskirts of Hollywood, begging to be acknowledged. For 6 long years, Kevin Costner auditioned, disappeared, and returned again, knocking on doors that never opened, reading lines to faces that didn't look up. He was cast in The Big Chill, only to have every single scene cut from the final release, erased before the world could even know he was there. He sat alone at the premiere, watching a story he'd once belonged to unfold without him, his name missing, his faith hanging by a single trembling thread. He wasn't just broke, he was invisible. But instead of surrendering, he went to acting classes at night, learning to turn silence into truth and rejection into resilience. "Dreams don't open doors," he would one day say. "They just give you the strength to keep knocking." And in 1985, when Lawrence Kasdan, the same man who had once cut him, called and offered him a role in Silverado, Kevin Costner finally stepped into the light that had been waiting for him all along. When the camera rolled, the man Hollywood had overlooked for years burned across the screen like he had been holding his breath all his life just to exhale in that moment. The applause that followed wasn't luck, it was survival made visible. What does glory taste like when it's mixed with hunger, humiliation, and sleepless nights? For Kevin Costner, it tasted like redemption. He didn't arrive in Hollywood like a star descending. He erupted, raw and unrelenting, like a storm no one saw coming. The man who once scrubbed boats and drove trucks now stood at the center of screens that once ignored him, his face filling theaters, his presence undeniable. Silverado in 1985 marked his arrival, but it was just the beginning. He moved with quiet confidence, magnetic and human, a reminder that real acting wasn't pretending, it was revealing. 2 years later, The Untouchables made him the face of American virtue. Steady, moral, unyielding, he wasn't just playing Elliot Ness, he was embodying every man who had ever stood against chaos and chosen integrity instead. The film made over $100 million, but more importantly, it gave Kevin what money couldn't: respect. For the first time, he wasn't begging to be seen, he was working to live up to the image people now had of him. Then came Bull Durham in 1988, followed by Field of Dreams in 1989, and with them, Kevin Costner's name was carved into the heart of American cinema itself. When he stood in that golden cornfield and whispered, If you build it, he will come. Audiences felt it wasn't just a line from a script. It was a message to every dreamer who had ever built something in faith and waited for the impossible to find them. But by 1990 at 35, Costner wanted more than just to act. He wanted to create. He mortgaged his own money, formed Tig Productions, and set out to make Dances with Wolves, a project that the studios dismissed as insanity. A 3-hour Western in Lakota? It'll kill your career, they warned. It's suicide, but Kevin refused to bend. The quiet, he told them, is where the truth lives. He wanted to give a voice to those history had silenced, to tell a story that would speak for people whose stories had been erased. The production was brutal. Storms destroyed sets. Actors quit. The budget ballooned to $22 million, and he spent countless nights alone in a freezing trailer, wondering if he'd gambled his entire future on a dream no one but him could see. But when the film finally premiered, it didn't just succeed, it transcended. Dances with Wolves earned $424 million worldwide, won 7 Academy Awards including Best Picture and Best Director, and transformed the quiet boy from Linwood into one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. Yet in the middle of that historic night, as applause thundered and flashbulbs burned, Kevin stood still and whispered to himself, "I didn't trust myself." The crowd roared, but to him it sounded like silence. The same silence that had once filled his small childhood home. The years that followed were a whirlwind of triumph and exhaustion. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves shattered box office records in 1991, grossing $390 million, yet critics mocked his accent as if perfection could erase authenticity. He smiled through the press tours, through the red carpets, but each cheer began to feel like a chain tightening around his spirit. The same year, he joined Oliver Stone's JFK, a bold and polarizing masterpiece that dared to question the government itself. Any discussion of what could be true, Kevin said, can only make us freer. And when The Bodyguard came in 1992, he waited patiently, nearly a year, for Whitney Houston to say yes to the role. He turned down a $10 million upfront salary, gambling instead on a share of the profits, a decision only a man who once counted quarters for gas would have the courage to make. It was as a risk that paid beyond imagination. The film grossed $411 million worldwide, and its soundtrack, anchored by Whitney's immortal "I Will Always Love You," sold over 50 million copies, while Kevin earned more than $20 million from his share. By 1993, he was among the highest-paid men in Hollywood, commanding $10 million per film, a staggering ascent for a man who once whispered, "Just one more day in a freezing apartment." Yet, beneath the trophies and headlines, the cost of glory was mounting, because what no one saw was that behind the golden light of fame, Kevin Costner was still that boy from Linwood, quiet, unshaken, and carrying the same invisible weight he had always known, that success, no matter how loud, can never silence the echoes of where you began. Friends said Kevin Costner rarely slept during those years, running film sets by day and editing by night, driven by an energy that bordered on obsession, a fire that refused to dim even when exhaustion clawed at him. "Success can be lonelier than failure," he once confessed, his voice heavy with the weariness of a man who had climbed too high, too fast. When everyone tells you you're right, you start to wonder if you still are. And then, as if life decided he had flown too close to the sun, came the fall. Waterworld in 1995 was meant to be his next great triumph, his boldest vision yet, but it nearly destroyed him, body and soul. Filmed amid storms and endless chaos, the ocean turned from a backdrop into a battlefield. Hurricanes ripped through sets, budgets ballooned to an unprecedented $235 million, and at one point, Kevin nearly drowned when a stunt went wrong and he was left tied to a mast, struggling to breathe. The press feasted on his suffering, branding the film Kevin's Gate, turning the man who had once been Hollywood's golden hope into its favorite target. But the true heartbreak wasn't the headlines, it was the silence that followed. His next film, The Postman in 1997, was even harsher in its punishment, sweeping the Razzies for Worst Picture, Worst Actor, and Worst Director. The same hands that had once held Oscars now shook over unpaid bills and contracts no one wanted to honor. But even then, Kevin refused bitterness. He didn't curse the world or retreat into nostalgia. Instead, he did what he'd always done since the beginning. He went back to work. Smaller projects, simpler stories, westerns too quiet for the modern audience, because he had learned long ago that the applause was never the goal. "I've never been afraid of beginning again," he said, and in that sentence lived his whole truth. Greatness for him was not the roar of the crowd, it was the strength to rise when the noise faded. For years, he walked through silence, that same silence that had shaped him as a child, when dreams were fragile and hope was something you whispered to yourself before sleep. After the chaos, there was no need for critics to remind him that he had fallen. He already knew. He felt it in the empty rooms, in the phone that stopped ringing, in the hollow ache of recognition that never came. Hollywood, which had once bowed to him, now looked through him as if he were a ghost haunting his own success. I wasn't broken, he would later say softly. I was emptied. And that's how you find what's real. The papers mocked him as a relic of the 90s, a man past his prime, vanity wrapped in flannel. He denied nothing. You can't answer every lie, he said. You just outlive them. Fame, once intoxicating, now echoed through him like a distant bell he no longer wished to chase. He could live without applause. He couldn't live without purpose. And for a time, he had lost both. Some nights, his body ached as much as his heart. The weight of decades spent chasing dreams pressed down on his bones like a confession. But still, he rose. There was something left to say, something left to prove, not to the world, but to himself. In Aspen, that winter came early. Snow blanketed the world in stillness, muting everything but thought. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls, while Kevin sat in the silence that had once terrified him. Sometimes he hiked alone through the snow, the sound of his boots crunching like punctuation in a prayer. He didn't ask why the world had turned away. He asked why he had needed it so much. And in that quiet, he found clarity, not bitterness. Perhaps you must fall, he realized, to remember how to rise. One morning, he watched the snow erase his footprints and felt peace, real peace, for the first time in years. That winter, he began to write again, not for fame, not for acclaim, but to remember what creation felt like when it came from love instead of pressure. Out of that silence came Open Range in 2003, a humble western with more soul than spectacle. It made $68 million in a $26 million budget, but its true value couldn't be counted in numbers. It gave Kevin his voice back. The truth doesn't need to shout, he told a friend. It just needs time. He had learned that fame teaches you how to rise, but failure teaches you how to be. Then, like the tide returning to shore, came Yellowstone in 2018. Quiet turned thunder. At 63, Costner stepped into the boots of John Dutton, a weary patriarch fighting for the land and legacy that defined him. I don't play heroes, Kevin said, his voice carrying that familiar restraint. I play men who try. And that humility resonated across America. Yellowstone became cable's most watched drama, pulling over 16 million viewers each week. By its fifth season, he was earning $1.3 million per episode, not for vanity, but for endurance. Yet Kevin never measured worth in numbers. Purpose was his currency. On set, he still arrived before dawn, boots dusted, script in hand, rewriting lines between takes. You can't fake the truth in a man's eyes, he told a young actor once. And if you ever try, the camera will betray you. But even with his career revived, another dream stirred in him. The dream that had refused to die. Horizon, an American saga, a story he had carried since 1988, a vision too stubborn to fade. Studios said it was too long, too quiet, too costly. He made it anyway, mortgaging his home and pouring $38 million of his own into the film. If it fails, he said, it fails with my name on it. Under the burning Utah sun, Kevin stood beside the camera, wind clawing through his coat, fatigue etched into his face, but his voice steady. Keep rolling, he murmured. We'll get it. He wasn't chasing perfection. He was chasing truth, the same truth that had guided him through every storm, every silence. When Horizon premiered at Cannes in 2024, critics were divided, but Kevin smiled. He wasn't chasing approval. He was keeping a promise. To the boy who once whispered to himself in the dark, just one more day, the film earned just $38.7 million, barely breaking even, but the real profit wasn't measured in dollars, it was in faith. That night, as the lights dimmed and the screen faded to black, Kevin stood alone at the back of the theater, the final frame painting his face in gold. He wasn't watching success, he was watching survival. At 70, Kevin Costner stands not at the top, but beyond it. A man who has turned loss into legacy, work into worship, and silence into song. He didn't just make movies, he made meaning. Because for Kevin Costner, truth was never something you found. It was something you became. She once called him the quiet one, the boy who always looked like he was already somewhere else, chasing dreams invisible to everyone but him. 3 years later, in 1978, that quiet boy stood beside her at a small altar, wearing a borrowed ring and carrying nothing but the foolish, beautiful faith of youth. Their home smelled of paint and promise, their furniture rescued from sidewalks, their nights lit by cheap wine and endless talk about the someday they both believed was waiting. Cindy Silva worked double shifts to keep the lights on, while Kevin fought through Los Angeles traffic, for auditions that ended in humiliation and empty promises, always coming home to the sound of her voice telling him softly, "Don't quit." When their first daughter, Annie, was born in 1984, followed by Lily in 1986, and Joe in 1988, he wept openly in the hospital each time, holding tiny hands as if he could protect them from the world just by sheer will, whispering vows to build a life worthy of them. For a while he did. Their days were painted with golden light, picnics under the California sun, lullabies drifting through open windows, laughter echoing in the halls of a house built on love, not wealth. "Cindy believed in me before anyone else did," he once said. Her faith was the wind beneath every beginning, but success cruelly devours what it feeds upon. The Untouchables, Field of Dreams, Dances with Wolves. Each triumph carved his name into Hollywood marble, but with every ovation came another silence at home. Fame arrived not as a blessing but as a flood, and soon the man who once smelled of paint and sweat came home carrying the scent of distant hotel rooms and studio lights. Cindy waited through missed birthdays, holidays blurred by jet lag, and weeks that turned into months of absence. She raised 3 children in Ventura, reading about her husband in magazines she never bought. When Kevin stood under the golden glare of the 1991 Oscars, perfectly dressed, smiling for the world but hollow inside, Cindy sat alone at home with 3 sleeping children, watching him through a screen that felt colder than glass. Trust doesn't break in a moment, he would later reflect. It fades, like the light at dusk. They tried to save it, taking breaks from filming, seeking counseling, escaping to cabins where they once laughed like children. But distance had already taken root in the soil of their love. Whispers of long nights and on-set flirtations began to spread. Nothing proven, yet everything poisoned. The woman who had once finished his sentences now spoke in whispers to keep from crying, and the man who once promised forever began to realize he no longer knew how to go home. "Success can be lonelier than failure," he admitted years later. Somewhere between airports and premieres, Forever quietly expired. In 1994, after 16 years together, they filed for divorce. It was not rage that ended them. It was the quiet exhaustion of 2 people who had loved too deeply for too long and forgotten how to rest. Early negotiations were brutal. Cindy's lawyers reportedly sought nearly $160 million, not from greed, but from heartbreak and betrayal. After months of cold silence, they settled at roughly $80 million, one of the costliest divorces of its time. There had been no prenup, only trust. She received the family home and custody of the children. He kept his production company and the heavy, unshakable weight of success. "You're going to see the people you love most, your children, only half as much," he said once, his voice breaking in an interview that still haunts him. The night the papers were signed, he packed boxes labeled family, movies, memories. They shared one last meal. Not accusations, not bitterness, just exhaustion. 2 hands reached for the same glass out of habit, then stopped midway, realizing habit was all that was left. Outside, flashbulbs popped like distant thunder. Inside, the silence roared louder than applause. Hollywood called it one of the most expensive divorces in history, but for them, it was something deeper. It was the funeral of a life they once built from nothing but love. Cindy withdrew from the public eye, her absence louder than any statement. Kevin threw himself into work, convinced that motion could drown the ache. Yet no matter how many scripts he read, how many red carpets he crossed, the emptiness followed him. He could rebuild fame, but not the laughter of 3 children under one roof. Years later, when his hair had turned to silver and the noise of fame had softened into memory, he drove alone to the old house in Ventura. The garden was gone, the paint cracked, but the wind still moved the curtains just as it had when they were young. He stood at the doorway where she once waited for him, hearing the ghost of her laughter, the echo of small feet running down the hall that no longer existed. For a moment, the man who had conquered the world saw the boy he used to be, lost, hopeful, forgiven. "Home," he whispered, "is not a place, it's the time you can't get back." In that stillness lay every lesson he had bought with his pain, that love doesn't die from anger, but from absence. That success is hollow when it costs the ones who once clapped first. That the truest wealth is not measured in trophies or box office numbers, but in time shared with those who see you not as a legend, but as you. Kevin and Cindy chose kindness amid the ruins. They co-parented without bitterness, standing side by side at graduations, birthdays, and weddings, bound not by marriage but by the faces that carried both their eyes. Their story remains the most human chapter of his legend. The sunlight and the storm, the rise and the ruin, the proof that even the brightest love can break, yet still leave behind something sacred, something true. And in the quiet years that followed, as the echoes faded and the cameras turned away, Kevin Costner carried that truth with him, learning to live again in the silence, still chasing stories no one else could see, but this time knowing exactly what they cost. The man who had once believed in forever now moved through life carefully, as if every step might break something too fragile to fix, as though love itself had become glass beneath his feet. Then, in 1996, when he least expected it, a gentle light entered the quiet spaces of his life. Her name was Bridget Rooney, a woman of quiet grace and natural poise, the heir to the Pittsburgh Steelers legacy, raised among privilege but carrying none of its arrogance. They met at a charity event in Aspen, where the air shimmered with laughter, snowlight, and champagne. She looked at him not as the world did, not as a headline or a legend, but as a man still trying to remember what warmth felt like. She asked him softly if he still believed in happiness. Kevin smiled, a weary half-confession in his eyes. "I still believe," he said. "I just don't know if I deserve it anymore." Their connection was brief but real, the kind that doesn't blaze, it glows. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to exhale, to be seen not as a star or a survivor, but as human. Out of that fleeting chapter came something permanent, something pure, a son, Liam Timothy Costner, born later that same year. When the news broke, Hollywood roared with its usual noise, the tabloids circling like vultures. But Kevin met it all with unflinching honesty. There was confusion at first, whispers of denial, until a DNA test confirmed what both hearts already knew. Without hesitation, Kevin stepped forward, not to defend himself, but to protect what mattered. He accepted full responsibility, set up a trust fund, and ensured his son would never know the ache of absence that once defined his own childhood. "I won't let him grow up wondering if he matters," he told a close friend. No boy should learn that kind of silence. For Kevin, it wasn't about scandal or reputation. It was about conscience. For the first time since his divorce, he was building something again, not for cameras or critics, but for a single life that would quietly carry his name. Their relationship, tender and true, eventually reached its natural end in 1998, parting without bitterness, without spectacle. Bridget went on to marry businessman William Koch, and even years later, spoke kindly of Kevin, calling him a devoted father and a man of quiet responsibility. And Kevin, true to his word, stayed in Liam's life, visiting him often, sending gifts, showing up at milestones, but never turning the boy into a headline. "I've made enough noise for 2 lifetimes," he would later say. It's good that he gets to live in silence. That brief romance wasn't a scandal, it was redemption written softly, proof that love, even fleeting, can leave something sacred behind. Liam became the quiet miracle that taught Kevin that not every consequence is a punishment. Sometimes it's a gift wrapped in responsibility. In that quiet responsibility, Kevin found grace, the kind that comes not from fame, but from doing right when no one is watching. He thought the storms had finally passed, that the winds of heartbreak had run their course. He believed that after decades of rebuilding, life had at last offered him peace. And then, when his heart was steady but cautious, she appeared. Christine Baumgartner. She wasn't the wild spark of youth. She was its antidote, calm, confident, elegant, and patient. A model and handbag designer 2 decades younger than him, she carried the kind of presence that didn't demand attention, but effortlessly held it. They met in 1998, a connection that flickered into something deeper, though it wasn't without its pauses. They drifted apart in 2002 when Christine longed for children, and Kevin, scarred by past endings, feared beginning again. "I was afraid of losing myself in what I'd already lost once," he admitted later. But destiny, persistent and patient, has a way of waiting for the brave. "I couldn't lose her over that," he confessed. "She was everything I didn't know I needed." On September 25, 2004, under the wide blue sky of his beloved Dunbar Ranch in Aspen, Kevin Costner married Christine Baumgartner in a ceremony that felt less like a Hollywood wedding and more like a homecoming. White tents glowed under the mountain sun. The scent of pine mixed with the crisp wind, horses grazed beyond the altar, and Christine arrived in a horse-drawn carriage, her smile trembling with joy. As she walked toward him, Kevin whispered to a friend, tears in his eyes, "I didn't think I'd get this chance again." For nearly 2 decades, they built what seemed like heaven on earth. 3 children, Caden Wyatt in 2007, Hayes Logan in 2009, and Grace Avery in 2010 turned his ranch into a living fairy tale. He built snow forts with them in the Colorado winters, chased them barefoot along the beaches of Santa Barbara in the summers, grilled barbecue by the lake, watched movies on the couch with popcorn and tangled blankets, and told bedtime stories in the same gentle voice that once commanded Hollywood stages. For the first time in decades, Kevin Costner wasn't playing a hero. He was one. "This," he said in an interview, is what I was running toward all along. He saw in Christine not just a wife, but a partner who anchored his restless heart. Her calm steadiness balanced his ceaseless drive. Her patience softened the sharp edges fame had left behind. He took fewer roles, spent more time behind the camera, and poured his soul into Horizon, an American saga determined to leave behind something meaningful, not for critics but for his children to inherit. For a man who had lived too long in hotel rooms and movie sets, the laughter around the dinner table was more precious than applause. It felt permanent. A second act no script could ruin. But life, in its quiet cruelty, doesn't always end its stories with fireworks. Sometimes paradise doesn't burn, it erodes. It begins in silence, in missed breakfasts, in glances that don't meet, in doors that close softly instead of slamming. The love that once lit mountains can fade like the last light of evening, not because it stops existing, but because both hearts grow weary of holding it. Yet even as the cracks began to show, Kevin still believed in love, even if it no longer looked the same. Because through every storm, through every ending, he had learned that love, no matter how fragile, is still worth the risk of touching. By the early 2020s, the rhythm of Kevin Costner's life began to change again, not with the fanfare of triumph, but with the slow, quiet drift that creeps in when work becomes a refuge from the heart. The long days on the set of Yellowstone stretched into months. The weight of Horizon, his self-financed epic, devoured his savings, his sleep, and slowly, his peace. While the world saw a man at the height of his creative power, at home, the silence was growing louder. Christine, once radiant in the glow of their family life, began to fade in the shadows of his absence. She still set the table for five, even on nights he didn't return. The silverware lined neatly as if waiting might summon him back. "He's always gone," she confessed quietly to a friend. "I miss the simple things. Coffee, breakfast, a day with no schedule." What she longed for was not grandeur, but presence. Yet the love that had once felt eternal began to starve for attention. It didn't end in anger, not at first. It faded the way sunlight disappears behind mountains, slowly, beautifully, and then all at once, the silence between them began to hum like a warning too soft to notice until it became deafening. Then came May 2023 thunderclap. Christine filed for divorce citing irreconcilable differences. Kevin was on set, beneath a vast western sky he had built from dust and dreams, when the news reached him. Crew members said he froze mid-scene, script pages fluttering in his hands, his eyes tracing the ink of her signature, the mark that ended 19 years of belief. Later he would say quietly, "It felt like the ground came out from under me." What followed was not the quiet unraveling of two tired hearts, but a public storm, a wildfire of court filings, dollar figures, and heartbreak measured by spreadsheets. The headlines shouted about millions, but none of them spoke about the smallest tragedy of all: 3 children waking up in separate houses, waiting for a father's voice that now came through a phone. The divorce moved with brutal precision, bound by the cold machinery of an ironclad prenuptial agreement. Christine's lawyers sought $248,000 per month in child support. The court reduced it to $63,000, figure that sounded enormous but still couldn't measure the price of losing what once felt unbreakable. Under the terms of the prenup, she was ordered to leave their Santa Barbara estate, the home where each of their children had taken first steps, learned to swim, and laughed under summer light. Neighbors later recalled that when she left, the curtains fluttered in the ocean wind like wings folding for flight. That evening, Kevin returned to rooms that smelled faintly of her perfume and the sea. And for the first time in years, he realized silence has a scent. Then came the cruelest cut of all. Photographs splashed across tabloids showing Christine walking the coastline beside Josh Connor, a man Kevin had once called a friend. They had shared dinners, laughter, trust, and now that trust lay shattered in glossy ink. There was no proof of betrayal, but pain doesn't need proof, it just needs presence. For a man who had built his name on loyalty, it felt like a wound too deep for words. "I didn't want this," he told a close friend quietly. "I still love her, but some things you can't unsee." For the second time in his life, he was forced to divide a world he had built by hand. But this time, it wasn't money being halved, it was moments. His children's laughter, now split between weekends and calendars. 19 years together don't vanish quietly, they echo. She fought to preserve the children's comfort, he fought to protect their innocence. The marriage became lonely, she admitted in court documents. "I felt unseen," he countered softly. "I was trying to provide." Between them stood 3 children and the ghost of what once was perfect. By the close of 2023, the verdict was final. By early 2024, the marriage was legally over. The prenuptial terms held firm, but so did the ache. The first time, he confided to a friend, I lost half my wealth. This time, I lost half my heart. Yet, even as his life fractured, Kevin kept filming. On set, under the scorching desert sun, he directed Horizon while his own horizon collapsed behind him. Fame had never felt so hollow. He had once been the bodyguard, the protector, the savior, the man who shielded others from pain. Now, he was the one left unguarded, bleeding quietly behind the camera. Years from now, the court filings will be forgotten, but the images will remain. A father alone in a trailer, script pages trembling in his hands as the wind rattles thin walls. A kitchen light burning in an empty Santa Barbara home, no one left to turn it off. A suitcase rolling across a stone driveway while three children watch from the window, too young to understand how something so whole can end without a villain. Out of that silence rose a truth deeper than fame, sharper than loss, that no matter how powerful you become, you can never outgrow the labor of love. That success cannot substitute for presence. That some losses teach what triumph never could. When the noise fades and the years grow long, the numbers will tell their own kind of story. 7 children, 3 mothers, and 1 heart that never stopped trying to build a single home from the pieces. It was never about how many lives he touched, but how deeply he tried to stay in each. Kevin Costner continues to co-parent, to show up at birthdays, school plays, and quiet moments that never make headlines. Because love, when it's real, doesn't end with a signature. It transforms. It becomes duty, then memory, then grace. In the story of Kevin Costner, this wasn't just another Hollywood heartbreak. It was the fall of a man who once built entire worlds and learned that he could not always keep his own. It was the storm that stripped him of everything but faith, the chapter that forced him to face the one truth his movies had always whispered, that even when the world takes everything, what remains, love, family, forgiveness, is enough to rebuild from. It taught him that even after decades spent creating horizons for others, the only one that truly matters is the one reflected in the eyes of his children. And sometimes, it's not death but betrayal that teaches us how fragile grace can be. Sometimes the most divine courage is not in the roles we play on screen, but in choosing, after everything, to keep loving when love no longer promises to stay. When the lights fade, when applause dies, and when fate quietly reclaims everything you once thought was yours, what remains? For Kevin Costner, the answer was never in fame, not in the thunder of applause or the shimmer of gold statues, but in the quiet, sacred debt of love, owed to the 2 people who shaped him before the world ever knew his name, his parents, Bill and Sharon Costner. They were not people of fame or fortune, but of grace and grit, quiet souls who asked little from life but gave everything they had. Bill Costner, a ditch digger turned powerline technician, came home each night with dust in his hair and dignity in his hands, proof that labor, when done with integrity, is its own kind of poetry. Sharon, a soft-spoken social worker, carried the sorrows of strangers through her days, yet still found enough tenderness to make home feel like peace. Their house was small, their life modest, but love lived in every corner. Kevin grew up watching his father fix what was broken, from fences to feelings, while his mother filled the air with faith and patience. From them, he learned 2 lessons that became the pillars of his life, that work is sacred, and that kindness, though often silent, echoes longer than applause. But for all the stories Kevin Costner would later tell on screen, the one he could never finish was theirs. When his mother fell ill, he was far away, lost in the noise of Hollywood, chasing the dream she had once told him to chase. The phone calls grew shorter as the deadlines grew closer, but her voice never changed. "You're doing fine," she told him softly one night. "Just don't forget to rest." He promised her he wouldn't, not realizing it would be the last promise he'd ever make to her. When the call came, he was on set, surrounded by lights so bright they burned his eyes. "She's gone," someone whispered. He stood still, script in hand, the world narrowing to a single heartbeat. He didn't make it in time to hold her hand, didn't get to hear the last words that only mothers say for their sons. At her funeral, he stood between his brothers, his heart breaking in silence. "She carried other people's pain so they wouldn't have to," he said softly. Maybe she carried too much. Grief, he thought, would dull with time, but 2 years later it returned, crueler, closer. His father, Bill, followed her into the silence, as though one heart could not bear to beat without the other. The news came early in the morning, the kind of message that leaves you hollow before you even begin to understand it. He sat alone in a hotel room, his phone still glowing with words that shattered him all over again. He had missed his mother's final breath, and now, his father's too. "It's the curse of distance," he said later. "You spend your life chasing everything you think will make them proud, and when you finally do, they're gone." At the funeral, rain fell over the grass like forgiveness. He looked down at his father's casket and remembered the hands that had built everything that mattered. The fences, the toys, the foundation of a son who would one day build dreams for millions. He never asked for credit, Kevin whispered. Just honesty. I hope I earned his pride. That night, long after everyone had gone, he sat in his car, headlights off, the dashboard light flickering across his face. No cameras, no audience, just a son, alone, realizing that the two people who had held the world steady for him were gone. Losing them so close together hollowed him in ways success could never fill. Fame, wealth, the glow of 1,000 movie posters, all of it felt weightless against the quiet gravity of loss. When your parents are gone, he would say later, you become the parent of yourself. Perhaps that is why his films in the years that followed grew softer, deeper, filled with fathers and sons, with long goodbyes and the ache of time. Field of Dreams, Open Range, Yellowstone. They all carried the same heartbeat, that of a man still talking to his parents through the work they inspired. He stopped chasing the noise of Hollywood and began listening again, to the same kind of silence they once lived by, the silence that meant love, labor, and presence. Sometimes when the world feels too loud, he drives out to his ranch in Aspen, stands under the same sky they once dreamed beneath, and whispers a line that only they would understand. I made it, but not without you. Because the truth is simple, the world taught him how to shine, but his parents taught him why it mattered. And even now, when the applause fades, it is still their voices he hears, a father's steady hum, a mother's soft prayer, reminding him that every story worth telling begins and ends at home. The world remembers the day Whitney Houston left us, the sirens of breaking news, the shock that rippled across continents, the heavy, stunned silence that followed. She was only 48, too young to die, too loved to be forgotten. For most of the world, it was the loss of a voice. For Kevin Costner, it was the loss of something deeper, a soul connection that had quietly shaped him. They first met in 1991, when Hollywood already saw him as unshakable and the world saw her as untouchable. But behind the spotlight, both carried the same loneliness, the kind only fame can breed. Perhaps that's why they recognized each other instantly. Two spirits who understood how heavy perfection can feel. The Bodyguard was meant to be just another romantic thriller, a story about protection and vulnerability. But when Kevin looked across the table and saw Whitney's hands trembling over the script, something shifted in him. Studio executives didn't want her. She was untested, they said, a singer, not an actress. But Kevin saw what they couldn't. The raw truth of her, the quiet grace beneath the fear. He fought for her, insisted on her, and promised to protect not just her role, but her spirit. And in doing so, he created not just a film, but a bond that would outlast both the applause and the pain. Some in Hollywood whispered that casting a black superstar opposite a white leading man would confuse audiences, that the world wasn't ready for such a pairing. But Kevin Costner didn't flinch. She's the one, he told the studio heads with unwavering conviction. If she says yes, I'll wait as long as it takes. And he did. One long year of patient belief until Whitney Houston finally stepped onto the set, shy yet radiant, a trembling light unsure of her own brilliance. From that moment, Kevin became not just her co-star, but her anchor, the steady hand behind the legend. He shielded her from pressure, studied her marks, whispered jokes to ease her nerves, and stood by her after every take. She was scared, he would later recall, but she was magic. Between scenes, they spoke not as celebrities but as souls, about faith, home, and the quiet loneliness that fame hides behind its glittering mask. She called him my safe place. He called her the miracle I got to protect. And when the cameras rolled, that fragile trust became something immortal. When The Bodyguard premiered in 1992, the world stopped to watch, to listen, to feel. The image of Kevin carrying Whitney through the rain became one of cinema's eternal moments. The film earned over $400 million, but its greatest legacy was not money. It was a song. Whitney's trembling, golden voice in I Will Always Love You was not just a melody, it was a confession, a promise, a farewell disguised as forever. The world heard chemistry. Kevin heard courage. She made the whole world feel safe for 4 minutes, he said softly years later. But as time passed, the noise of fame began to turn against her. The headlines grew crueler, the spotlight harsher, and the sparkle in her voice dimmed beneath the weight of expectation. Kevin watched from afar, proud yet powerless, knowing that some battles can't be fought for another soul. People forget, he once said quietly, that behind every voice is a person just trying to stay strong. Then came the call that no heart was ready to hear. February 11th, 2012. Kevin was in California when a voice on the other end spoke the words that broke him. Whitney Houston was gone. found alone in a Beverly Hills hotel room, hours before she was meant to attend a pre-Grammy event she had been excited about, filled with plans of a comeback, dreams half-written, hope still flickering. The light that once illuminated the world had gone out. News anchors stumbled through their words, their voices cracking mid-sentence. Across the globe, silence fell like a shadow. In churches, fans lit candles, thousands of tiny flames trembling in the wind. A broken choir of grief. Radios played her songs on repeat, each note sharper than the last. Around the world, from New York to Lagos, London to Seoul, people stood still, unable to believe that a voice that once filled the heavens could be silenced so suddenly. It wasn't just the death of a singer, it was the end of an era. The loss of innocence itself. Kevin sat for hours in silence, staring at nothing, whispering only, "Are you sure?" Later he said, "It felt like a light went out that I had been walking toward my whole life." When her funeral was announced for February 18th at New Hope Baptist Church, the same church where a little girl named Whitney first sang gospel, Kevin was asked to speak. He wrote his eulogy by lamplight, his pen pausing often, letting tears blur the ink of his memories. On the day of the service, he stood before her casket, the cameras broadcasting his grief to millions. His voice trembled, but his heart was steady. "Whitney," he began softly, "you weren't just good enough, you were great." He spoke of her fear of not being enough, of how the world had tried to tell her she was unworthy even as she carried the divine in her voice. "They were worried you weren't ready for the bodyguard," he said, "but I was. I always believed in you." Then, as the church fell into breathless stillness, he whispered the line that broke the world's heart, "And I will always love you." The choir stopped. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. It was the kind of goodbye that no director could ever script. Too real, too human, too holy. Outside, the streets overflowed with mourners. Some sang softly, others stood in silence, tears catching light like glass. For a few moments, the entire world, divided by race, faith, and distance, grieved as one. Fans left flowers at concert halls and photos on city sidewalks. They weren't just mourning a legend, they were mourning who they had been when her songs first saved them. Kevin didn't watch the coverage. He stayed home. Lights dimmed, the echo of the church heavy in his chest. In the years that followed, he spoke of her rarely. Once, he admitted quietly, "I wish I could have been there when she needed someone to protect her again." Friends said that whenever "I Will Always Love You" played on the radio, he would reach for the dial, not out of denial, but reverence, as if stepping softly out of a room where someone he loved was still sleeping. When The Bodyguard turned 30 in 2022, Kevin finally spoke again. The movie worked, he said, because her heart was real. Perhaps that's all he had ever wanted people to understand. Not the fame, not the fall, but the heart. For the world, Whitney Houston's death marked the silencing of a voice that once lifted churches and healed souls. But for Kevin Costner, it was the loss of a sacred promise, the echo of a friendship built on faith, loyalty, and the belief that even the most beautiful souls sometimes need to be protected from the world that loves them too much. She left too soon, with songs unsung and dreams still waiting, but her voice remains, floating somewhere between heaven and earth, proof that some lights don't die, they just move higher, where they can shine forever. And if you listen closely, between the notes, you can still hear him whisper, not in sorrow but in love, "I believed in you." Then, softer still, "I believe in you still." For Kevin Costner, age is not a gentle number written in the calendar's ink. It is a quiet war waged beneath the surface, a daily duel between the fire of the soul and the fatigue of the flesh. It's the long, slow battle between the man who still believes he can conquer mountains and the body that reminds him how many he already has. The world has seen him as the hero, the sheriff, the cowboy, the guardian who stands between chaos and calm. But what the world never sees is the man who limps home long after the cameras have gone dark, wrapping his aching knees before sunrise just to climb back into the saddle. It never sees the quiet endurance, the breath caught between pain and pride, the man who endures not for fame but for truth. Every victory carved its scar into his skin. Waterworld burned it, Open Range cracked it, Hidden Figures tested it. During filming, he suffered through kidney stones so severe that even heavy medication barely softened the edge, yet he refused to miss a single day. "Maybe the anger in that scene came from a real place," he once said. It did. Every performance, every heartbeat, every line was earned through pain. Today, at 70, the body that once carried him through storms and deserts bears the quiet cost of that devotion. His shoulders ache in the cold, his back, once iron, now remembers every fall and every explosion. His hands, which once gripped reins and rifles with absolute certainty, tremble slightly when the mountain wind cuts through aspen. The doctors call it wear and tear. Kevin calls it proof. Pain, he says, isn't my enemy, it's my reminder that I'm still alive, doing what I love. He moves slower now, but there's a new kind of purpose in that slowness, a deliberate grace in every step. Each morning, before the sun crowns the peaks, he wakes to the chill of the Colorado dawn and steps out into the thin air of his Dunbar ranch. The frost bites, but it also reminds him he's still here, still fighting, still part of something vast. He walks the same trails he once walked with his children, the echoes of their laughter still hidden in the wind. Sometimes he feeds the horses himself, their warm breath rising like ghosts in the cold morning air. His knees protest, his back argues, but he keeps moving because motion is faith made visible. Movement keeps me alive, he says. It reminds me that I still belong to the world. The body may falter, but the heart, the old stubborn engine that has carried him through every storm, still burns like a furnace. Even now, as Horizon demands endless days under a merciless sun, he refuses the easy path. Crew members half his age watch in disbelief as he directs, acts, edits, and negotiates. His eyes tired, his stance weathered, but his spirit unbroken. During breaks, he sits quietly, staring at the horizon, the land stretching before him like an unfinished prayer. You can't fake the truth of a man's eyes, he once said, and his still shine with that same quiet defiance, dulled by time but never dimmed. Time, relentless and merciful, has taken its share from him. The strength of youth, the lightning recovery, the illusion of invincibility. But what it left behind is rarer. Grace, the grace to know his limits and still push past them. The grace to transform pain into prayer, exhaustion into gratitude. There are mornings when the ache stays longer than it should, when his back stiffens and the ghosts of Waterworld and hidden figures come to visit, whispering their old lessons. But he doesn't curse them. He takes their weight, folds it gently into his work, and lets it breathe life into every performance. For millions of fans now older themselves, carrying their own scars and stiffness, there is something sacred in watching him still rise, still ride, still believe. He has become a mirror for everyone who wakes up sore, tired, and uncertain, but chooses to keep going anyway. His body carries the wreckage of time, but his presence carries its redemption. In that, Kevin Costner has transcended acting. He has become a living testament to endurance itself, a man who proves that strength isn't the absence of pain, but the courage to carry it with dignity. Those close to him speak of a quiet ritual that says more than any speech. Late evening in Aspen, the sky a blaze of gold, Kevin stands by the fence line, watching his horses graze in the fading light. His hands rest against the weathered wood, the veins sharp, the lines deep like rivers carved by years of storms. He breathes in the scent of pine and soil, as if memorizing the light itself. Behind him lies a life of thunder and trial. Before him, another horizon still waiting to be reached. He knows the body will fail one day. Everybody's does. But the stories, the faith, the grit, those will outlive the flesh. Maybe I've slowed down, he once said with a half smile, but I haven't stopped. That, perhaps, is his truest masterpiece. Not a film, not a fortune, but the refusal to surrender to time. He stands for everyone who has grown older but not smaller, who bears the weight of years yet still chooses to move forward. For everyone whose body has betrayed them, but whose heart still knows how to fight. He is proof that meaning can blaze, even when strength fades. Every wrinkle, every scar, every ache is not a mark of loss but of survival. Life's way of whispering, you're still here. Keep riding. Now, at 70, Kevin Costner stands as a monument to the quiet resilience that built him. He was born in a humble house in Linwood, California, the son of a ditch digger and a social worker, and now gazes out across empires shaped by his own hands. His net worth, exceeding $250 million, is not a shrine to greed but a testament to endurance, to the boy who once slept beside moving boxes and now owns landscapes that look like America itself, vast, wild, and free. His Dunbar Ranch in Aspen is a dream carved into earth, 160 acres of mountain solitude where pine trees whisper prayers and the wind hums like an old hymn. Valued at nearly $250 million, it isn't just a home, it's the living soul of everything he's worked for. 3 homes grace the property: a timber and glass main lodge where sunrise paints every wall in gold, a lakeside cabin built for mornings of still reflection, and a river house where the sound of water feels like the pulse of time itself. Across the grounds, there's a private baseball field where his children once laughed beneath the sun, a skating rink where winter glows like memory, and trails carved through whispering woods that lead to nowhere but peace. On cold nights, when the snow catches the light of the fireplaces, the valley glows like molten gold, a quiet kingdom earned not by privilege but persistence. It is beauty without arrogance, luxury without pretense, and memory woven into every stone. And in that home, amid the silence of the mountains, Kevin Costner, older, slower, but unbroken, remains what he has always been, not just an actor, not just a star, but a man still riding toward the horizon, one steady step at a time. Further west, along the golden bluffs of Santa Barbara, stands Kevin Costner's Flint Ridge estate, a Tuscan dream sculpted in sunlight, worth nearly $60 million and gazing endlessly toward the Pacific. Its terracotta arches open into courtyards perfumed with lavender, its halls lit by Murano glass chandeliers and frescoes that seem to hold whispers of centuries gone by. Beneath its cool stone floors rests a 1,000-bottle wine cellar, each vintage a memory, each cork a year survived, a timeline of endurance disguised as elegance. The estate's library glows with amber lamplight, a private theater waits in silence while the stone terraces face sunsets so divine they seem painted by God himself. Here, between grandeur and gratitude, Costner finds the quiet symmetry of his life, a man who once built dreams from dust, now walking through living proof that persistence can become beauty. And yet, he moves between this world of quiet wealth and the rugged simplicity of Aspen with the same humility that once carried him through rejection, hunger, and obscurity. His garage is less a gallery of indulgence than a record of the man himself. A 1968 Shelby GT 350h Whispering Rebellion, a dust-covered Land Rover Defender 90 bearing the scars of film sets, a Toyota Tundra that remains his workhorse on the ranch, and an Audi S8 sleek and solemn, used for dawn drives along Highway 1 when the ocean fog hides the horizon. Friends say he also keeps a Harley-Davidson for the rare days he chases silence, and a vintage wooden boat docked near Santa Barbara, the one he pilots alone when the sea feels more honest than the city. But what defines him is not what he owns, it's what he gives. He has poured millions into the causes that matter most: research for Parkinson's disease, funding children's hospitals, supporting women's shelters, aiding first responders. He's hosted charity galas at his own home, auctioned private stays at Dunbar Ranch to fund relief for those who have nothing. Money, he once said, isn't success, it's a tool. And tools are meant to build something. Between Aspen's silence and California's sun, he divides his time among the only things that have ever truly mattered: his craft, his family, and the horizon. There are no new scandals, no romantic headlines, only a man who has learned to find peace in the storms he's already survived. He is the father of 7 children, each one carrying a different echo of his story, a living reflection of the man behind the legend. Annie, Lily, and Joe, born from his first marriage, each carved their own place in the world. Annie, the eldest, a producer and founder of Fierce Studios, mirrors her father's strength and creative courage. Lily, the artist and singer-songwriter, carries his tenderness and introspection, her haunting voice filling quiet rooms where Kevin sits, proud but unseen. Joe, who chose to work behind the camera, honors his father's devotion to storytelling without chasing fame. Liam, born in 1996, the quietest of them all, lives far from the public eye, bonded to his father by a respect that transcends distance, a relationship built not on words but mutual understanding. Then there are the youngest 3, Caden, Hayes, and Grace, the children of his last marriage, still teenagers, still bathed in the golden light of youth. Caden, born in 2007, is drawn to music and film editing, fascinated by the craft that built his father's name. Hayes, born in 2009, rides horses fearlessly across the Colorado plains, and recently shared the screen with Kevin in Horizon. And Grace, the youngest, born in 2010, is the family's bright flame, athletic, witty, fiercely protective of her father. Together they visit him often, sometimes to ride through Aspen's open valleys, sometimes to gather in his private theater in Santa Barbara, where old home movies flicker across the screen. Birthdays, beach days, laughter caught in 8-min and grain. As the light dances over their faces, time bends. The man who once raced between film sets now sits quietly, eyes glistening, whispering, "Family isn't a chapter, it's the whole book, and I'm still writing mine." The years have marked him, but not broken him. The back still aches from old stunts, the kidneys still remember sleepless nights, yet he rises before dawn, writes, directs, dreams. His horizon, an American saga, the Western epic he mortgaged his fortune to create, is no longer about glory. It's about endurance, legacy, finishing the story that began long before the cameras ever turned on. When asked about legacy, he doesn't boast. He just smiles that slow, knowing smile and says, "I don't need statues. My legacy is the life I lived and the people I loved." Behind the awards, the money, the decades of stardom, there remains the boy from Linwood who once believed stories could change the world. And now, through every frame, every wrinkle, every scar, he's living proof that they can. To the world, Kevin Costner is a Hollywood icon, the man who made us believe in heroes again. But to those who look deeper, he is something greater, a parable of persistence, a reminder that hardship is not the opposite of grace but its gateway. His story tells us that dreams are not built on comfort, but on endurance, that pain is not punishment, but purification, that faith, not fame, is the true currency of a meaningful life. So wherever you are tonight, whether in a quiet house, an empty room, or standing at the twilight of your own years, let Kevin's story reach you. Let it remind you that it is never too late to rebuild, never too late to forgive, never too late to begin again. If a boy from Linwood could rise from cardboard boxes to castles in the mountains, then hope still belongs to every one of us. We too can turn our wounds into wisdom, our struggles into strength, our pain into light. And if his journey has touched your heart, leave a tribute, whisper a prayer, or simply a thank you for the man who never stopped standing tall, who showed that life's truest riches are not measured in what we own, but in what we endure, what we give, and the love we leave behind.